My name is Robin. I'm going to be our presenter. You're going to hear my voice quite a bit for the next hour. I've been with GSA for 14 years, and during that time, almost every one of those years has been spent servicing our vendor community, you guys, our industry partners, our contractors. So I have a lot of experience in both group settings and one-on-one, and hopefully I can bring some of that experience to this presentation today. If you're interested, I'm in the Acquisition Workforce Training Branch, in the FAS Office of Customer and Stakeholder Engagement. Phew, a lot of words. You're not going to be asked to remember that. But that's the division within GSA where I reside. So let's get started. We're here today to talk about sales tracking systems. So this presentation is designed with a newer contractor in mind. So some of the information here, if you've had a contract for several years, this may be redundant or this may be stuff that you already know, but hopefully no matter where you are in this journey of federal contracting, I can shine some light on some topics and answer questions that you might have and make sure that we're all on the same page and we're all moving forward together with a similar and consistent understanding of what everyone's expectations are. So, sales tracking systems. Let's just start right at the top. Why do I have to track and report sales? Why on earth do I have to do this as a vendor? The reason is because GSA is self-sufficient through fees that it collects. So one of these fees is something called the industrial funding fee. So GSA does not get money appropriated to it like a lot of other agencies do from Congress, where the schedules program is entirely this self-sufficient thing where we charge a fee for the services that we offer to other agencies. Those agencies pay that fee and remit it back to us in the form of an industrial funding fee. You'll hear this called IFF for short. IFF is Industrial Funding Fee. It's what funds the schedules program. So like I mentioned, the IFF is paid by the customer. So whenever you sell, whatever it is you sell, if you sell tables to the Army, the IFF is included in that contract pricing, and it's paid by the Army. It's a pass-through. You collect it, you remit it back to us. It's 0.75% of each transaction. It's tracked and reported by vendors, you guys. It's included in your contract pricing, meaning it isn't a separate line item. So if it's $10, that $10 includes the 0.75% industrial funding fee. That's all the customer sees is that $10. You guys collect it, remit it back to GSA at certain points. So why do I have to track and report sales? Because it funds this whole schedules program. It's what keeps it going. That IFF is an administrative fee that covers the cost of everything that we do to administer, monitor, perform quality assurance on all of these 20,000 plus MAS contracts that we issue. Also, it's a contract requirement. Another thing I'm going to talk about quite a bit is your contract and why it's important. We'll talk in a minute about where you can look up information in your contract if you're curious about what these clauses are. But you have to track and report sales because it's a requirement. It's built into the contract. It's one of those things you have to do. And it will be reviewed during your contract assessment. So at some point, it's likely that if you have a contract now, at some point during your contract life cycle, you're going to undergo a contract assessment where essentially someone from GSA will ask you questions about all the transactions and all the sales that you've made. And you need to be able to demonstrate that you have tracked these sales and remitted your IFS accordingly. So why do you have to do it? GSA is self-sufficient. It's a contract requirement. It funds the schedules program. And at some point, someone's going to look over this information. And you want to make sure that you've been doing it right the whole time. So let's move ahead. What does the contract say? Excellent question. Like I said, contract requirement. There's not a specific contract clause that outlines the elements of an acceptable tracking system, meaning there isn't something that says, contractor, you have to use QuickBooks, you have to flag it this way, you have to do this, X, Y, and Z, and that's the only way we're going to allow you to do it. No. There are two contract clauses that govern how this has to work. So the first one is the examination of records by GSA clause. Basically, this clause gives GSA the right to examine records and determine compliance with the contract. So essentially this says that once we issue you a contract, by you agreeing to it and entering into a contract with us, you're giving GSA the right to examine your records to make sure that you're in compliance. And our goal is to make sure you're compliant. You're successful, we're successful. Like I said, the IFF funds all of this. So we need our vendors and our contractors to be as successful as possible. So we want to give you the tools and make sure everyone's on the same page, make sure everybody's doing everything correctly. The next contract clause that's important is the industrial funding fee and sales reporting clause. So it requires you to track and report sales made against your contract. It does not specify how, like I said, it doesn't say specifically how your sales tracking system should function, only that it does function. This industrial funding fee and sales reporting clause just says you need to have a functioning sales tracking system to accurately and timely be able to capture, track, and report sales and then remit IFF as necessary. So the contract says a lot. What does the contract say? Oh, buddy, it says a whole lot of things. But these are the only two things in terms of sales tracking that you need to be aware of. This examination of records clause and the industrial funding fee and sales reporting clause. If you're interested, you can look these up. You can dig out your contract and look these up and get the entire text of it. You can just Google search this contract or this clause number and get the full text of it also online. Let's move ahead. Okay, so how do I know what to report? So we talked about why I need to do it, why it's important. Okay, great. Well, how do I know what to report? We're going to talk a little bit about this. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how you know what to report. A sale is reportable when the following criteria are met. So you got contract items were sold, an eligible user made the purchase, there's no evidence that the customer intended to use a different contract. So let's look at all three of those kind of individually. So contract items were sold. Anytime you sell contract items, that is step one. Number two, an eligible user made the purchase. That means whoever bought those contract items from you was eligible to purchase from your contract. So, we're thinking of people like the Army and the Air Force and the Department of Defense and the big name, easily recognizable customers that, yeah, everybody understands the Army can use the GSA contract. But there's other ones also. We'll talk about that in a second. But you sold contract items, you sold it to an eligible user, and then there's no evidence that the customer intended to use a different contract. So let's pick on the Army for a little bit longer. They have the option of using a schedules contract. They can come to GSA and say, we need something quickly. We're not interested in all the red tape and jumping through the hoops that is required for us to issue our own contract. We would like just to use this existing contract, just place an order for whatever it is we need and get it. They don't have to do that. The Army can go ahead and issue their own contract, and they can put it up for full and open competition and put it on BizOps, and they can spend 6 solid months negotiating this stuff if that's what they're interested in doing. They don't have to. The benefit of having a schedules contract is that it speeds this process up tremendously. Procurement cycle time in the GSA world is about 10 days on average. In the open market, it's something like 270 days or something ridiculous. So having everyone on the call that has a contract, or if you're just thinking about getting a contract, that's the draw. That's the huge benefit of having this contract, is that it makes it so much easier to sell things to the government, because essentially you've already been issued a contract, and now customers can just place orders against that existing contract. So I digress. I'm getting into some marketing stuff, but there's no evidence that the customer intended to use that other contract that took them half a year to go through. Meaning you got a task order, you got a purchase order, it lists your contract number on it. That's them indicating that they wanted to use your existing GSA contract. So a sale is reportable when the following criteria are met. You've sold contract items, you sold them to an eligible user, and they didn't indicate that they wanted to use a different contract. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that because that's a simplification of how this works in the real world. And those of you living in the real world know that it can be a little more complicated than that. I like flowcharts, I like graphs, that's just me. If you don't, bear with me. But what do I report, what don't I report? So you do report items on your price list, services on your price list, and you report things under the correct SIN. You don't report open market items or travel. So those are just two, again, simple examples. Open market items, that's just a fancy term that means things that are not on your contract. So if you sell tables on your contract and you also sell a fish tank to the Army, that fish tank's an open market item because it's not something that's listed on your contract. So you do not report sales of open market items. And that's a pretty important distinction that I'll probably mention a few times going forward. You report contract items, you do not report open market items. That's important because oftentimes you'll find that you might get an order and it's a mixture of contract items and open market items. You need to be sure that you have a way to distinguish in your system when it comes time to report. You're not just extracting that whole sale and reporting the whole sale. You need to be able to distinguish contract items from open market items because, one, it's a contract requirement to report accurately just contract items. And two, if you report open market items, that means you're paying IFF on open market items. That's money out of your own pocket that you don't need to remit back to GSA. So clearly, no one wants to do that. So you report open market items. Oh my goodness. You do not report open market items, report contract items. I'm going to move on before I get any further tongue-tied. Excellent. Who's eligible to use my contract? Great. So we talked about those three things. It has to be a contract item. It has to be sold to an eligible user. No evidence of another contracting vehicle in place. So we just talked about contract items versus open market items. Next, you sold it to an eligible user. Who's eligible to use this contract? Meaning, who can I sell to? Who are my customers? So we've been talking about, like the Army, the Navy, etc. But there's a lot more than just that. Luckily, there is a list. GSA maintains a very comprehensive listing of who is eligible to use our contract vehicles. It's got a fancy name. It's ADM 4800.2I at the moment. There's a link in here. So if you download the PDF version of this, you can just click on this link and it will open it up. You can find all this online. Eligibility to use GSA sources of supply and services. Excuse me. So this document, it lists all agencies, activities, and organizations that have been determined to be eligible to use GSA contracts or GSA sources of supply. So you've got the Army, Navy, Department of Education, etc., the ones that are easily recognizable. But then you also have these eligible quasi-governmental groups or non-governmental groups or groups that are in one way or another subsidized by the government and that have been deemed eligible to use sources, GSA sources of supply. So this entire group, all these people, these are called eligible users. So anyone on this list is eligible to use your contract. So I would encourage you, and with new contractors, this is one of the first things that we give them, this ADM 4800 document, eligibility to use GSA sources of supply. Take a moment, look that up, download it, go through it. It's going to list everyone that you can think of off the top of your head, and then it's going to list a bunch of them that you've never occurred to you could use your contract. These are all customers. These are people you could market to if you wanted. These are people you can target to try to sell your products to. So I encourage you to take a look at that, go through it, and really study it. Everyone in there is in this group called eligible users. These are eligible users. That's an important term. Okay, some of you may be aware that in certain circumstances, state and local governments can purchase off of your contract. So there are certain programs that allow state and local users to access to schedules contracts. A couple of these, they have names like Cooperative Purchasing, Disaster Recovery Program, Public Health Emergencies Program, 1122 Program. I'm not going to go into detail on each one of these. And some of these only apply to specific commodities like law enforcement, drug enforcement materials and equipment, law enforcement equipment, disaster recovery equipment, things like that. But these are all avenues because when state and local governments need things, usually they need it quick, and they're looking to get whatever it is that they need to respond to a disaster or to buy IT equipment in a hurry, whatever it happens to be. So if you are interested in doing business with state and local governments, which I highly encourage you to pursue, there's a page on the GSA website, and I've got a link to it right here. So again, download the PDF, click this link, it'll take you right to it. It's going to provide you all the information about the various programs that are available for you to market and potentially sell things to state and local customers. Okay. Remember we talked 2 slides ago, that group's called eligible users. And then we've got another group called state and local program users. The reporting rules are a little bit different for each one of these. And I'm going to go through this kind of quick because I don't want to muddy the water, but it's important that you understand that there is a distinction between how these 2 groups are treated and viewed by GSA personnel. So eligible user group, contract items are sold, there's no evidence of any other procurement vehicle in place, then it's a reportable sale. In this situation, sales are reportable unless there is clear evidence otherwise, meaning there's some clear evidence that the Army went ahead and issued their own contract with their own contract number, their own contract terms and conditions. You got a stack of documents that was 3 inches thick that you had to sign, and it was a new entire contract that was not part of your GSA schedules contract. Zero evidence that they intended to use your GSA schedule contract. Absent that, if you're selling contract items, it's a reportable sale. So, for eligible users, Army, Navy, etc., contract items are sold, no evidence of any other procurement vehicle in place, then it's a reportable sale. State and local, kind of the opposite of the guidance for eligible users. There has to be evidence that the customer intended to utilize your contract. So absent that explicit evidence, regardless of whether or not contract items are sold, it will be considered a reportable sale. We could go on for a long time about the nuances between state and local and eligible users. State and local represents a pretty small overall percentage of GSA scheduled business, so I'm not going to harp on it too much. But I do want you to be aware that the reporting rules are just a little bit different depending on which group you're dealing with. The vast majority of customers that you will likely deal with are going to be from this eligible user group. It's going to be the Army, Navy, etc., whatever. Department of Defense is our largest customer. So odds are a few of you on this call have done business with the military or the Department of Defense at some point during your contract life. So that's the one I want to really hit home. If you're doing business with state and local government customers, it's just important that you understand that the rules might be a little different. We have resources that you can reach out to if you have questions, if you need one-on-one guidance about that. Whoops, jumping ahead here. We're going to get into some examples and some case studies here. So the evidence. So you mentioned, I'm going to go back a slide. This eligible user group, contract items are sold. There's no evidence of any other procurement vehicle in use. That's kind of a loaded term. What does this term evidence mean? So I'm going to explain that. I don't even really like using that term because it seems so harsh, but we're just talking about documentation, really. Evidence it begins with the delivery order or the task order, meaning the order that you get from the customer. So scenario 1. Your MAS, you get an order, your MAS contract number is listed on the order, and you've sold contract items. What does that mean? So that's a pretty clear indication that the customer intended to purchase items from the MAS contract, meaning you get the purchase order in, right there at the top it lists GS 23F, blah, 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 your contract number clearly, and you sold contract items. That's pretty clear. The customer came to you, they wanted to buy contract items, they wanted to utilize your MAS contract. That's a reportable sale. In that situation, that's as clear-cut as it gets. That is a reportable sale. So let's slice and dice this a little bit more finely, though, and see how this plays out. Again, drawing on some real-world examples that I've seen over my time being out in the field. So scenario number 2. Those of you that have been doing this for a while might be familiar with this scenario. No contract numbers listed on the order. However, you've sold contract items. So you get the purchase order in, and box number 2 at the top where it's supposed to say contract number, it's just totally blank. So there's no contract number listed on the order, but you sold contract items. The fact that the customer did not indicate that they intended to utilize the MAS contract is irrelevant in this situation. You're selling contract items to an eligible user without affirmative evidence of another contracting vehicle in place. That's a reportable sale. So there has to be some, without a clearly understandable distinction that the Army wanted to use a different contract or they wanted to use their own contract, and they issued you a new contract and you negotiated it. Without that evidence, then it will be considered a reportable sale. Just the fact that they didn't put the contract number on there is not evidence enough that they did not want to utilize your GSA contract. This happens a lot because oftentimes the end user is separate from the purchasing official, and for whatever reason, the contract number can get overlooked when they are filling out these purchase orders or task orders. So those of you that have been doing this for a while are probably familiar with this scenario because it happens fairly often. Even more examples. Again, these are from the real world, things we have seen very frequently. Scenario number 3. So you got a mixed order of contract items and open market items, meaning, you sell tables on your contract and also open market, you sell fish tanks. And you get a purchase order and they want tables, and lo and behold, they also want a fish tank. So the contract number in this situation may or may not be listed on the order, but there's no evidence of another contract vehicle. In this situation, the contract items are reportable, the open market items are not. So if we stick with the fish tanks and the tables, you report sales of tables, you do not report sales of fish tanks. And if you remember earlier in the presentation how I mentioned you need to have a system in place to make sure that you can extract individual line items from each transaction when it comes time to report, because you don't want to be in a situation where this order is flagged in your system as a reportable sale and you report, if the order is $1,000, you report the whole $1,000. Instead, you need to just report the $500 table and the $500 fish tank, not report the $500 fish tank because it's open market. We never report open market items. Scenario number 4. Contract items are sold to an eligible user, but the order lists a contract number that is not your MAS contract number. In this situation, the order was purchased using a different procurement vehicle, meaning that scenario I've been talking about. The Army has issued their own contract. It's their prerogative. It's what they wanted to do, and that they felt that was the most efficient thing for that procurement. That's fine. So regardless of how you quoted it at the very beginning, even if you quoted it as an MAS contract sale, if they come back with a purchase order and it lists a completely foreign contract number, then it is not a reportable sale. That's a situation where you have that affirmative evidence. The Army saying, nope, we're going to use our own contract. We're not interested in using the GSA contract. So you just keep track of that separately, and you don't report those sales. So that is one where, even though you sold contract items and it's an eligible user, they've said, nope, we're not using your GSA contract. We're using a different contract. You do not report that sale. It is not a reportable sale. Phew. Okay, those 4 examples cover the whole spectrum of, in broad strokes, how this can work in the real world. It can be very clear-cut, meaning It's very straightforward. They issue a purchase order. It's got the MAS contract number. You sell contract items. Pretty straightforward. All the way to it's mixed. You got contract items and open market items on the same order, which is perfectly allowable also. Let me add that. Yes, you can quote contract items and open market items at the same time. We got a whole different hour-long webinar about scope of contract, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. Be sure you distinguish between contract items and open market items on the quote, on the invoice, etc. Perfectly allowable for you to do. And then all the way to scenario number 4 where they've said, nope, we're going to use our own contract. We're not interested. Okay, all that being said, the point of this presentation and this webinar is to describe to you what a working sales tracking system might look like, answer some questions, address some common pitfalls that we see. But what does a working sales tracking system look like? I mean, can't I just tell you? Wouldn't that be easy? Well, it's different for each vendor. It's vastly different for each vendor because it's up to you. You had a business before you started doing work with GSA, more than likely. You might have been doing this for years or decades, but you have a system in place you have some type of accounting system or some type of sales tracking, customer relationship management software, or you just have a color-coded file cabinet where you put certain things in yellow, you put certain things in red. Whatever you have, that's been working for you. It's going to be different for each vendor. So we don't specify and say that you have to do this, you have to do that, and you have to do the other thing too. We just ask that you have a system that works. And also we ask that you be able to demonstrate to us that it works at certain points throughout your contract. So ask yourself these questions. How am I going to identify and track reportable sales in my system? Meaning, sales are going to occur in January, and come April, I'm going to have to report those sales. And a couple months are going to go by. So at the end of that reporting period, how am I going to extract information about sales that may have happened a couple months back when it's not fresh in your head? How are you going to identify and track those in your system? How are you going to train your sales staff on GSA requirements? Well, I'll give you a little pro tip here. You can send them to webinars like this, and we'll do it for you. We'll do some of it for you at least. How will you extract reportable sales when it's time to report? How will you ensure reports are accurate and complete? Meaning, do you audit that? Do you check it over? Who's in charge of it? Is it the same person? Is it a different person? Is it someone in a completely different city that's doing your record keeping? What do you do if you find errors or oversights? What kind of quality control are you going to have built into this process of yours? And I've summed it up with this last bullet. It's impossible to define every scenario because every situation must be evaluated accordingly. So I've been to major U.S. manufacturers and producers of IT equipment where they got a 20-person team and we got banker's boxes stacked up to the ceiling. I've also been in someone's living room where, and their cat keeps jumping on my lap and everything in GSA goes in the bottom filing cabinet. And everything that's not goes in the top. And it's just the person, and she does it all herself. So I've seen the entire spectrum. Both of those systems can work. Both of those systems also cannot work. It just depends. You have to ask yourself some of those key questions and just use some common sense and think, how am I going to make sure this works right? Think about it ahead of time so that at the end of the reporting period, you're not in a mad dash and a scramble to try to go over 1,000 records and 1,000 sales over the past quarter to make sure that you're doing it correctly. Moving on, sales tracking system summary requirements. A sales tracking system that functions properly identifies, tracks, and reports GSA sales accurately and completely. Seems pretty straightforward. It reports all transactions within the proper period. It retrieves data easily. And it separates scheduled sales from other federal sales and commercial sales. And I hate to beat this to death, but it can be as simple or as complex as it needs to be. It depends on your business. Okay, before we get into this, we're going to talk about the systems that you use to actually report sales very briefly. We have, again, dedicated presentations to just that stuff. So I want you to keep in mind that as you go forward, keep in the back of your mind that someone from GSA is probably going to look over this information at some point. And that person is going to look over information, and they're going to look at transactions that occurred 2 or 3 years ago, right? So it's important that you establish a process now and kind of implement a system to make sure that you do everything accurately and completely now. Make sure your sales staff is trained, your admin staff is trained, they understand the GSA requirements. A lot of the times what we see is maybe your sales staff didn't quite understand the nuances of how this worked, or the person that got the invoice or the person that got the order wasn't properly trained on what to do when they got a purchase order, how to code that within the system. So there are some very simple steps that I think as a vendor that you could take to make sure that the system does not need to be super robust, but it just needs to work. And that's all that we ask. Moving on, what system do I use to report sales? So you'll notice this webinar is titled Sales Tracking Systems Training. We could spend another hour talking about sales reporting systems, especially because in years past, we really only had one system, and now we have 2. So some contractors will use the 72A system. So there's some of you on the line here that are probably familiar with the 72A system, and there's a link to it here. This is where you report summary level data, and you do it on a quarterly basis, meaning this quarter I reported I generated $100 in sales under SIN 123. Other contractors will use FAS sales reporting. We have a link to it here. And this is, you may have heard the term TDR, or transactional data reporting. This is the newer system where you report actually, instead of summary detail, you report transactional data detail, line item detail for each transaction, and you do it monthly. So depending on the schedule that you operate in, some of you may be using the 72A system, and some of you may be using the TDR system, or the FAS sales reporting system. If you aren't sure, you can check on the VSC. The VSC stands for Vendor Support Center. You don't have to remember that because I put a link to it right here. So again, download this, follow these links for me. So I'll just summarize this. There are 2 different systems. There's 72A, which is our traditional system, and then there's TDR, which is kind of the newer cutting-edge way of reporting sales. It's not mandatory for everybody yet. We're piloting it with certain schedules, but if you have questions about sales reporting in any form or fashion, step 1, check the VSC. I'll leave you with some other avenues for people you can turn to later in the presentation or before we leave. So here we go. Where can I find more info? So you're going to get back to your office and you're going to say, man, that bozo Robin really blew through that. I really, really wish I could find some more information. Well, here's where you go. GSA resources. We've got, number 1, this webinar. You're going to download it. You're going to take it back with you. You're going to share it with all your people. Number 2, GSA.gov and the Vendor Support Center, which is vsc.gsa.gov, which is also the next bullet point, the Vendor Support Center. Highly encourage you to check that out. It's a website just dedicated to vendors like you. So the GSA website can be a little intimidating because it's enormous. The VSC is essentially just tailored for vendors, schedule contract holders like you. You can also check with your contracting officer. If you're unfamiliar who that is, start with the Vendor Support Center. You can email us. We can try to find it for you. You can go to the Schedule Z library, which is another great resource that I didn't list here. You should know who your contracting officer is. So if you don't, if anyone on the call does not know who their contracting officer is, take this as a piece of homework, figure that out today, because that's pretty important. So you should know who your contracting officer is. And then the next slide. What is the next slide? Again, for those of you paying attention, I love charts and, flow charts. I love graphs. Start here. Is it a reportable sale or not? Is the customer eligible to use the GSA contract, the MAS contract? No, they're not eligible. Home Depot's not eligible. 99% of the time. So no, not a reportable sale. However, the Army is. So is it the Army? Yes. Is the product or service being sold on the contract price list? If it's a fish tank, no, it's not a reportable sale. It's an open market item. Fish tanks aren't on my contract in this hypothetical example, so no. However, if it's a table, sticking with the table and the fish tanks, then yes, the product or service being sold is on the contract price list. Yes. Is there evidence of another contracting vehicle in place? In this situation, perhaps yes. There's this crazy looking contract number that's completely foreign to me. I got a 3-inch tall contract that I had to sign, so yeah, there's evidence of another contracting vehicle in place, not a reportable sale. But if no evidence of another contracting vehicle, it is a reportable sale in this situation.